It's time. After all of these years, we're finally gonna do a bearded dragon care guide. Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. If you're new, welcome. My name is Zoe, but most people know me as 𝘬𝙪𝙨𝙀𝙯, and this is my bearded dragon Tansy. She's a little dark right now because it is early in the morning, so all the lights in the reptile room literally just came on. But we're trying to start off the day strong by getting some things done, like filming. So it's probably been 2 years, maybe a year, since my last care guide. You guys know I don't put them out very often. I personally have a couple rules that I follow. I have to have an animal for at least a year, and I have to feel really comfortable with their care and feel like I know what I'm doing, and have them in their final enclosure. Now, since we moved, Tansy's enclosure isn't set up the way I'd like it to be, like it once was, so I'm gonna go ahead and link the video for when I first set up her enclosure so you guys can see what it looked like, because right now it's very bare bones. So before we jump into the video, if there's any care guides for the animals I currently have that you would like to see, let me know in the comments below. I have done a 𝘎𝙪𝙨𝙞 care guide, which was my most requested, so I have done that. And way back when, I did a Kenyan sand boa care guide, a corn snake care guide, and a crested gecko care guide. I think those are the only ones I have done, and I do have the dates attached to all my care guides so you can see how new they are, because obviously as the reptile community grows and we learn more, things are going to change. So it's important to note when the information that you're looking at was put out. And disclaimer, I do not claim to be an expert. These care guides are not supposed to be your end all for learning about reptile care. These care guides are just so that I can tell you what it is that I do with my animals that works, so you can get another keeper's perspective on how to care for these animals. So I'm going to talk about a lot of different things in this video that you're going to want for your bearded dragon. I will link my Amazon storefront below. In there I have different shopping guides for different species that I own, and there is one for bearded dragons. So if I mention something in this video and you're not sure where to find it, or if I say it's on Amazon, you can click that link, find the Amazon storefront, click that bearded dragon guide, and you will find recommended products there for them. So I always start off care guides with learning about the animal itself. So bearded dragons are an agomid lizard native to Central and Eastern Australia. It's very important to know where your animals are coming from when designing an enclosure for them. They come from drier habitats like semi-arid deserts, scrublands, and dry forests. They are a very popular pet reptile. You see them all the time because they are known for their very good attitude. They're fairly calm, they're great for handling, they'll hang out with you, they've got just a great temperament. They're very curious, they're social, they're entertaining, so they're just all around a really great pet reptile if you're looking for an animal that you can interact with. A couple key characteristics of the bearded dragon would be their spikes. So you can see those spikes along her head. She also has them along the side of her body. Those are key characteristics of the bearded dragon. Also, their throat. When they want to look more aggressive, or they're being defensive, or they're just very unhappy, they can punch that throat out kind of like a beard, hence the name bearded dragon, and it will turn much darker. They do enjoy both climbing and digging, so you want your setup and your care to replicate that. They are a diurnal lizard and a sun worshipper, which means they're going to be awake during the daytime, asleep at night, and they really like it nice and sunny and warm. Not warm, hot. On average, they're going to get about 18 to 24 inches in length. Tansy is very petite. She had a very rough start to life, very sick, so I do believe she's stunted. She's pretty tiny. Their lifespan, like most animals, as we improve our captive care, they're going to start to live longer. So on average, we're seeing about 10 to 15 year lifespans for these guys in captivity now. And they're going to reach their full length in about 1 to 2 years. Tansy's about 4 years old, so she's pretty much as big as she's going to get. Now the good news is, because these guys are so popular, they are readily available captive bred. A lot of people are breeding these guys. You see them all over at reptile expos. You see them on Craigslist, on Facebook. So it is very easy to get these guys very inexpensively. They're very readily available. Now the last kind of intro note I'm going to make is on cohabiting. Sometimes you go to like the pet store and you see lots of bearded babies together in an enclosure, and a lot of people think that's okay, and then they get a couple, keep them together, they think they need a friend. They don't. Your bearded dragon is going to be best on its own. Cohabiting can lead to many dangers, many issues. You might as well just avoid them altogether by getting one single bearded dragon and keeping it by itself. If you want to have multiple bearded dragons, go for it, but keep them in different setups. Alright, now that we've kind of got our information on the animal itself, let's jump into how to care for it, starting with the enclosure. Minimum standards for bearded dragons are 120 gallons or 4x2x2. They used to be 40-gallon breeders, so sometimes you'll still hear that. You'll still see people keeping them in 40 gallons, sometimes 55, sometimes 75. These are not really adequate for bearded dragons, especially when you're talking about aquariums, because those 55, 75, yes, they're nice and long, but they're not really deep enough. They don't really provide all that floor space that we want to be able to give to them. So a 4x2x2 minimum would be great. Really inexpensive option, Dubia.com. Shameless self-plug, I do have a discount for their enclosures. If you use the code 𝘎𝙪𝙨10, you can save on one of their enclosures. But there's lots of places to get enclosures. You can also build your own. The one that she's in is a 4x2x2 that my dad and I built. However, bigger sizes are becoming more popular, like 4x2x4s or 5x3x3s. So as big as you can go would be super awesome. The bigger the better, I always say. Especially with most bearded dragons averaging 18 to 24 inches in length. Because Tansy is so petite, a 4x2x2 works great for her. But for a normal sized bearded dragon, I would probably go a little bit bigger. Now let's talk about substrates. So there's two routes you can go with this. You can go the non-naturalistic substrate, the non-loose substrate that's been popular for years, or the loose substrate route that's gaining popularity. So for non-loose substrate, I'd recommend tile. That's what a lot of people use. Tile's super easy to clean, it holds heat really well, it gets nice and warm under the lights. But like anything, there's pros and cons to this, and a lot of people are moving into the more naturalistic side of things, providing loose substrate so they can do things like dig. The mix that I personally used for Tansy when I set her up was organic topsoil, natural play sand, and excavator clay. That creates a really nice mix of different textures and materials to create a very natural substrate. If you want something ready-made, just ready to go, there are things like 𝑘𝑠ahara, which is a bioactive mix that's ready to go. Dump it right in, all set. There's also other mixes out there that are meant for bearded dragons and these Australian species that are more of a sandy, rocky substrate. There's one, I forget what it's called, but it's literally like an Australian substrate meant for bearded dragons. It's meant to completely mimic what they have in the wild. And I really, really wanted to try that, which is why her enclosure isn't set back up yet, because when we moved, I was going to buy some of that, and it's like out of stock everywhere. So I'm still trying to see if I can get my hands on some to try it out. Otherwise, we're gonna have to try something else or go back to the original mix that I was using. So there's several different options depending on which route you want to go. What I do not recommend using is calcium sand. So there's this big myth that sand is bad for reptiles. It's going to cause impaction, make them sick, yada yada. Not the case. Sand is very natural. As long as you're getting the right kind of sand. Like I said, I use natural play sand. I can get it right from Home Depot. What you don't want to use is calcium sand. That's a big no-no. Vitamin sand, anything that like makes it sound like they're encouraging your animal to eat it, stay away from it. And then I don't use that natural play sand just by itself. I mix it with other substrates so it's a little more natural as opposed to like going to the beach. You also don't want to use anything that says like ground, I think it's walnut that's in one of the popular substrates. If it says ground nut, any sort of nut, stay away from it. You don't want that. Another thing you don't want is reptile carpet. A lot of people use this. I still see it a lot. You don't want to use this. It holds bacteria. It's difficult to clean. It's just not an ideal substrate to use. Like I said, if you're going to go non-natural, not loose, tile is what I would recommend. Otherwise, go for that loose natural substrate. Create your own mix. get a ready-made mix. There's lots of options out there. And it will allow your bearded dragon to explore its natural behaviors by digging. Alright, so now you have your substrate. Let's talk about how to decorate your enclosure and provide enrichment. So like I said earlier, they really like it nice and hot. They love to bask. So what I would recommend doing is getting some sort of rock, or if you're using tile, some sort of basking area, a basking log, something that can go right underneath their light that's going to hold heat and warm up really well, that they can go and lay on. So usually rocks are a really good thing for that. Tansy has this long piece of driftwood that she climbs up and sits on top of. So get creative, have fun with that. Some sort of thing that can sit underneath their basking platform and get nice and warm for them would be awesome. Of course, you want hides. You want your animals to feel very comfortable in their enclosures, and the way to do that is to make sure they have places to hide where they can feel safe. Now, because I'm a big fan of a naturalistic looking enclosure, I like using things like cork rounds, or in Tansy's case, these, I think they're grape wood, if I remember correctly. I got these right off of Etsy. They're just nice and big and hollow. They're nice big hides, and they look like they belong somewhere more dry, sandy, arid. So they fit the vibe of her enclosure much better than a cork round would. And then of course, if you're going with a naturalistic substrate, you can add plants. Things like different succulents work really well. Air plants. Things like different succulents or air plants work really well. If you need an idea of plants that are safe, I recommend going to Josh's Frogs, because you can literally go look at their list of plants that they sell and see what it is that they offer, because then you know it's safe. That's what I do. Again, rocks, not just for a basking platform, but throughout the enclosure, provides enrichment, gives them things to climb on, utilizes more surface area. Very awesome to incorporate into your enclosure, very natural. And then if you really want to go all out, you can give them a background. So I have an affiliate link in the description for custom reptile habitats. I love getting backgrounds from them, fake rocks from them, so you can get a ready-made background or kind of create your own by getting rock ledges that you can attach inside your enclosure. Just go crazy, have a lot of fun with it. Or you can make your own. So Tansy did originally have one that I made. I got really sick of it and tore it out, and then put in like a ready-made one that I didn't have to make. But I did make it. A lot of my backgrounds I make, so I have a lot of videos on how I do that, so I recommend checking those out if you're interested. Also, if you are going for one of those taller enclosures, a 5x3x3, a 4x2x3, a 4x2x4, that gives you more height, so utilize that height. Give them things to climb on. Nice big pieces of wood, nice big rocks, something so that they can utilize that extra height. Alright, now let's move into the details of care. So starting with humidity. Now, because bearded dragons come from a dry, arid habitat, a lot of people are scared of humidity when it comes to their bearded dragons. Now, humidity spikes are totally normal. So do you want it super humid all the time? Absolutely not. But if it rises up to say 60%, that's totally fine. So with bearded dragons, a nice healthy range would be about 30 to 60%. So that's quite a bit of wiggle room. So if it starts to get closer to 30 and you bump up that humidity and it rises up to like 55, 60, that's totally okay. That's a very good example of what would happen in the wild. And then you let it dry out and it comes back down and you just keep that cycle going. Now, how to add humidity? There's a couple different ways. Some people don't give their bearded dragons a water dish because their main water source is the food that they're eating, which we will get into. Now, as much as this is true, don't be afraid to give your bearded dragons water dishes. They will soak themselves, they will drink from it. Most of the time, I don't want to speak for all bearded dragons, but Tansy would. So if you provide a water dish, that's going to help raise the humidity because naturally it's going to evaporate. The other thing you can do is spray down the enclosure. If you opt for that naturalistic style and you add live plants, watering the plants is going to raise the humidity in your enclosure. Having plants in general is going to raise the humidity in your enclosure. So again, we're aiming for 30 to 60%. So now let's hop into our lighting requirements, starting with our heat. Now, as much as these guys love it nice and warm and hot and sunny, they're still going to need a cool area. So we call this a gradient. You need a temperature gradient. One side of the enclosure that's nice and warm, that contains a basking spot that's really warm, and then a cooler side so that they can self-regulate their temperature. So in that basking spot, remember we talked about either like a basking rock, a log, something where it's the hottest spot in their enclosure. we're aiming for about 110 degrees. That's what I go for tansy, somewhere around there. Now on the cooler side, I'm aiming for about 80 to 85 degrees. High 70s is also okay, but usually it's about 80 to 85 degrees. So naturally, if you're hitting that on that side and your basking spot is at 110, anything in between is going to be a little bit lower than that basking spot and creating a gradient down to that cool area. So your ambient temperature can be anywhere from about that 80 degrees to 99 degrees or such. So as long as you've got that basking temp and you've got that cooler side temp, you're gonna have a nice gradient. So how do we achieve these hot temperatures? So personally, I find that halogen basking bulbs just work so much better than reptile bulbs in general for creating a nice hot basking area. You can also use daytime basking bulbs that are meant for reptiles that you would find in any pet store. You have to be aware that you want that basking spot to be nice and hot. So that's why I like halogens, especially halogen floodlights specifically, because they create a nice wide area where they're providing heat. Now a note about these halogens, because they do get really hot, I do recommend getting a plug-in dimmer. That way you can control the heat that's being put out. Alternatively, if you're using a dome light fixture on top of an enclosure, you can buy the ones that already have dimmers attached to them to make your life a little easier, so you have less cords and things running around. But for all of mine, because my lights are installed inside of the enclosures, I get the plug-in dimmers so that I can control how much heat is being put out. And of course, you always want to have a temperature gun on hand so that you can check the temperatures in your enclosures. Super accurate and super easy. Now, do you need to provide heat at nighttime? Odds are you will not have to. So I don't provide heat to any of my animals at night. I let them all have a temperature drop at night because that is very natural of what would happen in the wild. I feel like I've been saying that a lot this video. Don't be afraid to let your bearded dragons cool off at night. At night, they can take drops up to 55 degrees. Now, I don't recommend that. If you're keeping your house at 55 degrees, how are you not freezing, first of all? But 75, low 70s, high 60s, totally fine for them. Now, if for some reason you feel like your house is dropping super low at night, maybe you live somewhere really cold in the middle of winter and have really bad insulation, what are you gonna do? I'd recommend getting a ceramic heat emitter and a thermostat. Ceramic heat emitters don't put off any light, so it's not gonna disturb their circadian rhythm. And then a thermostat so that you can control that heat being put off, because ceramic heat emitters do get really hot. So now we're gonna talk about something very important when it comes to caring for bearded dragons, and that is UVB. So UVB is very important when it comes to providing their body with calcium. Now I'm not gonna get into the whole process of that right now because this video would be very long if I went into detail about everything. I have other videos on this. I will put them up here if you guys are interested. But more or less, UVB equals calcium their body can use so they are nice and healthy and have nice healthy bones and grow well and avoid a lot of issues. So what UVB do I recommend? I always recommend Arcadia T5HO linear UVBs. You don't want to use those compact coil ones. Those do not last very long and they're not going to provide enough UVB for your dragon. Now, which one are you going to need? That's going to depend on your enclosure setup. So I recommend going to the Arcadia lighting guide, typing in bearded dragon, and it's going to give you a chart that shows you the different UVBs that you would use depending on your enclosure setup. Now you want your UVB to span about half the enclosure because again, we want to create a gradient. So you don't want them to be blasted with UVB all the time. You want them to be able to control the amount that they are getting. So you want your UVB to overlap your heat because UVB is coming from the sun naturally. So you want the two to go together. So you want to overlap your heat and then expand a little bit and then not have it on the other side of the enclosure. So that when they are cooling off, they're getting away from the sun, which means they're also getting away from the UVB. Now, very important to remember, just because the light is putting off light doesn't mean that it's putting off enough UVB. So for Arcadia T5HOs, it is recommended that you replace them annually. Now, if you invest in something like a solar meter, which can test the UV output of your bulbs, you might not have to replace them as often. It's probably been 2 years since I replaced her UVB bulb because we have a solar meter and I can test it. So I'm not unnecessarily replacing them and spending the money. Now, I wouldn't recommend doing this if you don't have a solar meter because you just really don't know. So better safe than sorry, replace them once a year. Now, if you have a solar meter, you want to aim for a UV index of 4.0 to 6.0. Most normal bearded dragons can tolerate up to about 7.0, but it's better just to aim for that 4.0 to 6.0 range. Now keep in mind there are more sensitive bearded dragons that aren't going to want this high intensity of UVB. Those are bearded dragons like silk-backed bearded dragons. This care guide and what I do refers to normal bearded dragons, so just keep that in mind. And then if you really want to go above and beyond, you can add another light. This is a third light, and that is a full spectrum light. This is, again, just really good if you're trying to create a very natural environment. It's also good for plants if you have live plants in your enclosure, and you can get them commercially ready for reptiles, or you can go a bit cheaper and do what I did and get a 6500K LED from Home Depot. But Arcadia has full spectrum, BioDude has full spectrum. These are all fantastic for adding extra light to your enclosures while also being beneficial. Alright, let's get into the bread and butter, their diet. So these guys are omnivores, meaning they're going to eat both plants and meat. Now in our case, that meat is mostly made up of things like insects. When they're babies, you're primarily feeding insects. As they get older, you want to increase the amount of greens they're getting and decrease the amount of insects. So it kind of flip-flops as they get older. So babies are going to be fed daily, again, mostly insects. Still give them their greens, but mostly insects. When they are reaching that juvenile stage, I'd still recommend feeding daily, but now we're starting to increase the greens. Once they're over a year of age and they're considered an adult, personally, I would feed every other day, not every day, because obesity is a big problem with bearded dragons. So personally, I would do every other day, salads daily, and insects about twice a week. Now when it comes to feeding your bearded dragon, just keep an eye on their body shape. Take monthly weights of your animals so you can track how much they're weighing. Just keep an eye on their body shape so you can determine the best feeding schedule and amount for your bearded dragon. Now, what kind of greens and veggies are we feeding? As far as greens, things like turnip greens, mustard greens, dandelion greens, collard greens, these are all really good greens that are a really good source of calcium. And additives like peppers, dandelions, squash, peas, green beans, these are all great additions to these salads to really spruce them up and provide good variety. Now, fruits can be given to bearded dragons as a treat. You don't want to overdo it. They are high in sugar and just not great for your animal, but they make a great treat. The best fruits you could feed would be mango and papaya. Again, great source of calcium, great calcium to phosphorus ratio, which is very important. But you can also feed things like banana and berries. Again, just don't do it very often. These are a special treat. When it comes to insects, we have things like crickets, black soldier fly larvae, which again, really good source of calcium. Silkworms, dubia roaches, those are all kind of the main feeders that are really, really good. And then you have things like mealworms, superworms, hornworms that will provide a good variety. Now, variety is super important when feeding animals. Just like we like a variety, so do our animals. So I definitely recommend switching it up, doing all those different things. Don't just stick to one. Do it all, switch it up. And on top of variety, you can also work in commercial diets like different rapaces, such as rapace grub pie. Now, very important to remember when you're feeding insects, you want to gut load them at least 24 hours before feeding, which means providing your insects with food for them to eat so that they have a better nutritional content before giving them to your animals. Now, as a special treat when it comes to protein, you can give things like mice pinkies and waxworms. Now, very important to remember that you also want to be supplementing your food with multivitamins and calciums. So personally, I use a calcium without D3 just about every feeding. I use Arcadia Earth Pro. You can also use Zoomed Repticalcium, which is what I used prior to using Arcadia supplements. And then I use a multivitamin with D3 1 to 2 times a month. So for me, it's every other week. And for that, again, I use Arcadia, but you can also use Reptivite, which is what I used prior. Now, there's lots of supplements out there. Again, I'm just using this care guide to tell you what it is that I do and what it is I use. Now, why D3 or without D3? Remember that UVB is helping them with D3 synthesis, so you don't want to overdo it with the D3. So because the calcium is just about daily, I don't want to be giving extra D3 when she's already getting D3. So since the multivitamin is only 1 to 2 times a month, that I do include the D3 in. Now the last order of business in this care guide is to briefly discuss some different medical concerns you can see with these guys. I'm not going to go into detail on them. This is all part of doing your research. I'm going to mention them. That way you know what to look for and what to research. So common things we see with bearded dragons. First one I want to mention is brumation. A lot of people in the winter, their beardies will go into brumation. This is kind of the reptile version of hibernation. So sometimes it can be difficult to tell if your reptile is slowing down for brumation or if they're sick. So a really good thing to research and understand. I'm very fortunate that Tansy doesn't brumate, which is why I don't really have a lot of experience to discuss this topic. Another issue to keep an eye on if you have a female is egg binding. Sometimes females will lay infertile eggs. They don't need a male to end up having eggs and having to lay them. So if you have a female, it's very important to keep an eye on them and understand that you may have to deal with a female that needs to lay eggs and how to go about doing that, providing a dig box and whatnot. Being able to consult a vet. So always, always, always make sure that you have a vet for whatever type of animal that you want to keep. Make sure that you have a vet that you can consult, because sometimes they do have difficulty laying those eggs and it is going to require surgery sometimes, which can be rather costly. A common reptile issue is respiratory infections. So being able to recognize the signs of that. Sometimes that can be wheezing, that can be bubbling in the nose, that can be open mouth breathing. So understanding the signs of a respiratory infection in a bearded dragon, so you can keep an eye on that. Now that usually comes from improper temperatures, improper humidity, or unsanitary environments. So if you have good humidity, good temperatures, and you're cleaning your enclosures, then a respiratory infection is very low risk, but it's not impossible. It is a very common thing that is seen in pet reptiles. So just being able to recognize the signs of that. Now a couple of very serious things that we do see in bearded dragons a lot due to improper husbandry can be gout and MBD. Now I have no experience with gout, so I can't speak on this too much. I do have experience with MBD because of my iguana that I used to have, who came to me with severe metabolic bone disease. And that is no joke. That's basically when they're not getting adequate nutrition, supplementation, lighting, the whole 9 yards, the whole package, and more or less their bones kind of turn to mush. So when you see bearded dragons that have legs that don't quite work that well, or they have spinal deformities, tail deformities, leg deformities, that's usually from metabolic bone disease. So very important to recognize the signs of metabolic bone disease, but make sure that you are also continuing to do your research and staying on top of your care so that that is completely avoided, because it is totally avoidable. So that gives you a couple medical conditions and situations to research to make sure you are well prepared for whatever may come up with your bearded dragons. Now of course there's always more out there, but those are the most common ones that you hear about. Alright, that is it for the bearded dragon care guide. I hope some of you found this helpful. Again, remember that this is not an end-all be-all. Continue to go do your research, find scientific articles, go to Reptiles, join Facebook groups, just be cautious about that, but get different keepers' opinions, and remember to always go above and beyond for your animals. You are responsible for their care and providing them with an enrichment-filled, happy life. So go above and beyond and do what you can for them. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments below. And as always, thank you guys for watching. We'll see you for the next video. Bye!